Right then, I'll just pray before we start. Heavenly Father, we pray that you be with us this evening as we look at your history through your people in the Old Testament, which is our history as believers in you. Lord, we pray that we would learn the lessons of history, that we wouldn't be doomed to make the mistakes of the past. And at the same time, we would look at the heroes of the faith, those good examples that are before us, that, Lord, that we might learn and apply those things in our lives. Amen. Okay, so this evening, it's a bit of a two-parter. 2 parts, about 45 minutes each, just looking at an Old Testament historical chronological overview. So when we come to the end of part 1, you can hopefully have a coffee and go to the loo and things like that. Now, anybody that works in education knows you should have some educational aims, and I want you to be educated. I want you to learn something this evening. So I set myself a few goals. So, for example, by the end of this evening, hopefully you will have an overview of the international history of the ancient Near East from late Bronze Age 3 period through to the Persian period. Now, we'll use a few long technical words, which hopefully I'll explain to you. But that's from a very long time ago to a very, very, very long time ago. Relate the Old Testament history to the context of the broader history in the ancient Near East. See, the people living in Israel and Judah of the time didn't live in a vacuum. It's not a story made up. You know, they had neighbours, and those neighbours have a history, and we can read about them. Appreciate the political and the theological dimensions of both the kingdoms of Israel and Judah at this time. What was it that made them tick? Why did they behave the way they did? And understand how the various Old Testament personalities relate one to another, how they bounce off each other, and to see the theological implications of those political decisions that Israel and Judah made. And those theological implications still hold true today. You know, it might be a long time ago and it's a very different world, but it's not that different sometimes when you look at the story. So, I'm going to start before the monarchy in the days of the judges. Now, I'm assuming that, you know, some of you are quite familiar. I'm not going to dwell on the familiar stuff. So we're going to, you know, bomb through and then we'll deal with the stuff that we're perhaps less familiar with. But let's start with the judges. So what do we know about the days of the judges and the days of the Exodus? Well, I am dating, and many scholars date the Exodus to be about 1450 BC and the conquest of the land about 1400 BC, although that's up for debate. But the archaeological record for the fall of Jericho, in my opinion, seems to put the conquest of the land at about 1400 BC. So during this period, that land was still nominally under Egyptian control, which the Egyptians were always having a fight with the Hittites up there in the north there in Turkey. So they're moving into the land that is still nominally under Egyptian control. Now, we read, we discover that in 1210 BC, that Mereneptah, one of the pharaohs, moved into the land and started trouncing the place because his taxes hadn't been paid by the Canaanites for a long time. And this is the earliest record at which we find Israel mentioned in any external source. And basically, Mereneptah is saying on his stele, he says, Israel is laid waste, his seed is not. Okay, so he's gone in and he's kind of trounced the area and he wants his taxes, thank you very much. So we know at that period, the Israelites must have been settling into the land. Now, as we read the book of Judges and 1 and 2 Samuel, you hear a lot about the Philistines. And the Philistines came on the scene shortly after then. This was part of the Sea Peoples. Now, the Sea Peoples were people that came from Crete, from Greece, that way. And it seemed like they were a bit bored living at home and decided to go and colonise the rest of the eastern Mediterranean and sort of caused upheaval all over the place. Now, the Philistines were a particular group of these people that happened to land their boats on the coast of what I would call the Levant. So the Levant is the area of where we've got Judah, Israel, Tyre, Sidon. We'll call it the Levant. Now, the Philistines were also kicking off and upsetting the Egyptians. And there is known as the invasion of year 8, where Ramesses III had to stop the Philistines. The Philistines looked like they were going to be taking over the world at this time. Okay, so he stopped this coalition of sea peoples from invading Egypt. Big battles were going on. It drew a lot of Egyptian resources at the time. And so basically, Ramesses III and the Egyptians lost control of that area of Canaan, that area of the Levant, because they were just like beaten to a standstill by the Philistines. So Egypt was safe, but they'd lost Canaan. And then the rest of the dynasty, the 20th dynasty, were pretty useless. They couldn't organise a bun fight in a cake factory, and so they weren't able to retake that territory. And so there was no further interventions in Canaan by the Egyptians. Now this period falls very nicely in to that time, that period of the Judges. Now what do we know about the period of the Judges? Well, I've just told you the Egyptians were pretty much off the scene and weren't interfering, which is one reason why they probably don't appear in the book of Judges. But we know also, in those days, there was no king in Israel, which would suggest the time at when they wrote that book, there was a king in Israel. But that's a continual refrain. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. And that wasn't always the best thing that they could do. We just see a downward spiral where we see Israel almost being flushed down the toilet because of the terrible things they've done. So if you're looking at Judges over this weekend, grab one of the ministry trainees. They've been doing the book of Judges on Yorkshire Training, and they've had an overview on that, so they'll be really able to help you on that one. Thought I'd point that one out. So, well, no king in Israel. Things aren't going particularly well when every man does what is right in his own eyes. So they think about having a king. So we come into that stage of the later Judges. And Samuel, who is one of the prophets, is in effect one of the last judges. So as we said, Egypt is off the scene. The Philistines are the regional superpower of the day, and the Israelites were the nobodies. In fact, we read in Samuel, it says, "Now there was no blacksmiths to be found throughout the land of Israel, for the Philistines said, lest the Hebrews make for themselves swords and spears." And basically, the Israelites had to go down to the Philistines to have their pruning hooks and their lawnmowers sharpened, and then they could go and use them in agricultural business. So the Philistines were a militarily superior power to rock-throwing Israelites. So they think if we have a king like all the other nations, we might get somewhere. We might actually have some centralised authority, and we might be able to sort of all think as one person. So Saul is kind of raised up as the king, and basically he centralises the authority. He's pretty much just a big chief amongst all the other chiefs, and follows this kind of Canaanite kingship model. So there are all these little petty kings all around in Canaan, and he's kind of at the top of the heap, and they all say, yeah, Saul's our king. He set up his capital in Gibeah, which is in Benjamin, and he fought against all the surrounding neighbours that used to give Israel a lot of hassle, like Moab, Ammon, Zobah, which is in Syria, Philistia, and Amalek. You can read all about that. So he kind of rises to the top of this heap, and he's a charismatic sort of guy in the right sense of the word. You know, he's winning battles, and people are going to follow him. Anyway, it all comes to a sticky end, and you can read all about it in 1 Samuel. But yeah, he loses the plot. He doesn't do what Yahweh says, and in the end, he falls on his own sword on Mount Gilboa while he's been defeated by the Philistines. And his body and his son's bodies are hung from the top of Mount Gilboa, which you can see behind the pillars there. So then we have David. David comes to the front now. And on your handout, there's a big long list of all the achievements, so I'm not going to dwell on what David did, but basically he captures Jerusalem, he sorts the Philistines out, the Moabites, the Edomites, the Ammonites, and King Hadassah the Aramean is defeated, and so everything that King Hadassah used to own up in Syria now becomes David's. So David is sort of reaching out, and he's subjugating all those neighbours around him and sort of solidifying his power. Damascus is also finally conquered. And like I said, you can read all about this in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel. This is the stuff that I'm assuming you probably know more about. So then when he passes on, Solomon comes along, he of the famed building the temple. Now, one of the interesting things, we start to see the Egyptians reappear in the story. And basically, Pharaoh Simon, he has a bit of a dust-up with some Canaanites who, living down near Giza. And he burns that city, and he gives the city to Solomon as a dowry, as he also gives his daughter to Solomon. Now, we're inclined to think, well, Solomon must have been really powerful if, the Egyptian pharaohs are marrying their daughters to him. In fact, it's more of a sign that the Egyptians were still not very powerful. Egyptians did not marry their daughters out of Egypt. In fact, they generally married them to their brothers. So here we've got the Egyptians trying to reach out and make some sort of allies outside the land. And basically they give Giza to Solomon so he can look after that important trade route north-south and also up through the central hill country. So Solomon is being co-opted to help out with the Egyptians there. And again, on your handout, you've got all the stuff about Solomon. So he controls the sale of horses from Cilicia, from the Hittites. And he gets wood from Hiram. There's chariot trading. There's trade ships. All the through trade that's going north and south, east and west, all gets taxed. There's copper and iron smelting that goes on down in where Eilat is today. Iron to Syria is exported to Egypt. There's the bronze foundries. Then there's lots of foreign dignitaries that come and meet him, and they bring gold and lots of other things like spices, weapons. And there's new sea routes open up. Now, if you look at all that, you realise that actually Solomon is the biggest trader in the area. His kingdom is built on trade, and everything that's going on there it's a bit like England was, a century ago. We were a nation of shopkeepers, and the thing that made Britain great was its trade empire. And Solomon is very much in that same mould. He's not going off having big battles and subduing people. He's building the empire with that. But there is a downside to this, and we see that Solomon also married a number of foreign wives. And, they brought their foreign gods, which, in the day seemed the thing to do. If your wife worshipped some foreign deities, it was only right that she could set up a little chapel, to worship Baal or whoever. But Solomon kind of got a bit involved in all of that as well. Now, the question I thought we ought to ask ourselves is, why did Solomon marry so many foreign wives? I mean, I know it says 700 and 300 there, which is probably over-egging the figure a little bit. But why did he marry so many? Was it because he was just, sex mad? Was it because he was just, losing the plot and was evil or something? Well, I think it's because he wanted alliances with the surrounding nations that brought wealth, influence, and protection and security. You see, Solomon's problem was he was putting his faith in his alliances and in the nations around and not in God himself. So I think when we look at Solomon, when we look at our own lives, it's what do we put our faith and our trust in? Is it in what the world uses to protect itself, or is it in the Lord God himself? Anyway, Solomon dies, and his son Rehoboam comes to the throne. And everything goes smoothly. He's inaugurated in the southern kingdom of Judah. Everybody loves him down there. It's the tribe he comes from. But up in the north, the northern tribes are feeling like they've been heavily taxed. They've been building temples, and they could really do with a bit of a break. And they want him to take his foot off the accelerator for a bit. Building projects are great, but we've had enough of them for now. Now, what he basically does is he goes up there and he thinks, well, what should I do? And he asks his advisor, who are all a bunch of young punks, and they all say, yeah, make them work twice as hard. And so the northern tribes tell him where he can go. And basically, the kingdom divides into two. Okay? It just splits. So from now on, and it's important that you get this in your mind, that you've got the southern kingdom of Judah, which is normally coloured blue on my slides, and you've got the northern kingdom of Israel, which has the green type. Okay? Now, the southern kingdom basically was the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. and the northern kingdom was all the other tribes. So there was this kind of division that went on. And when this happened, the Aramean provinces, that's Syria and Damascus, was lost, and they grew stronger and independent. The Philistine cities then broke away from Judah. Ammon and Moab declared their independence and broke away. Basically, Israel and Judah become two second-rate states, whereas once before they were a great kingdom together. Divided, they've just lost it. Everybody's kind of like left and taken advantage of the fact that these guys are now distracted. And in fact, they're so distracted, they're fighting amongst each other. And it never gets really better after this. The kingdom is divided. So you will see in the Old Testament that sometimes from now on, when it refers to Israel, it's referring to the northern kingdom. Anyway, Jeroboam I sets himself up as king in the northern kingdom of Israel. And he was one of Solomon's chief advisors who had to flee for his life during Solomon's lifetime, through no fault of his own, really. If you read the text, basically a prophet came up and said, you know what, one day you're going to be the king of the northern kingdom. And Solomon found out and wanted to kill him, which is a bit unfortunate if somebody just comes up with a word from the Lord for you like that. Anyway, so he became the focus of the opposition, and he set up these golden calves at Bethel and Dan. Now, the golden calves, are representative of the deity El, which means God. But, there's something going on there. Setting up idols, it's looking back to those golden calves. He's kind of losing the plot. Anyway, Rehoboam doesn't do much better down in the south, and his mother, Naamah, was an Ammonite princess, and she was into worshipping all sorts of things as well. And so, he started to slip and not worship Yahweh, the one true God. Well, anyway, while everybody's quarrelling amongst themselves between the two kingdoms and losing all their friends and neighbours, the Egyptians decide to reassert their authority in the land. So, in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, Shishak, king of Egypt, came up against Jerusalem. Okay, he was a Libyan noble who had got himself to the top of the pile and was now pharaoh, and he reasserts his authority. And that this little cartouche thing here was found in Megiddo, which is in northern Israel, and it refers to this guy Shoshonk, which is his Egyptian name. And basically, he goes through, trounces the land, takes a lot of money and gold, and sort of says, I'm in charge around here, and then goes home again. So down in southern Judah, Abijah, or Abijam, takes over when his father Rehoboam dies. And we're told that he walks in the sins of his fathers and continued the wars of Jeroboam. Now, some interesting things about him. His mother, Makkah, was part Aramean, and she worshipped Asherah. So he's already off to a sticky wicket there. Her father, was Absalom. Now, you might remember Absalom was the son of David who, caused the rebellion in the kingdom. So there was a bit of, angst there already in the family. Now, it's interesting about his name. So, in the book of Chronicles, he is referred to as Abijah, which is, my father is Yahweh. Whereas, in the book of Kings, he's referred to as Abiyam, meaning Yam is my father, Yam being the sea god. So, the writer of Kings didn't have a particularly high view of this king here and thought that probably he was just a Yam worshipper. So, it's one of those play on words. Anyway, he dies, and Abijah's brother, who came from the same Asherah-worshipping mother, was of a very different character. This is Asa. And Asa did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh. And so he tries to purge the land, and he chops down the idols and the Asherahs. Nevertheless, the heart of Asa was wholly true to the Lord all his days, and he brought gifts to the Lord. So it looked like there might be a turn here in Judah. Things might be getting back on a firm footing with Asa in Judah. Anyway, let's go back up north again. So you're often having to go backwards and forwards because you're trying to hold two histories in tension, which Kings and Chronicles seem to do quite well as well. Okay, well, in Israel, we've got a series of kings. So you've got Nadab, the Ephraimite, who's the son of Jeroboam the first. He's murdered after 1 year by one of his captains, Baasha, while on campaign against the Philistines. There's nothing like fighting the Philistines and getting stabbed in the back by your own officer. So Baasha decides he'll be king now, having killed Nadab. And he killed all of Jeroboam's descendants just to make sure there wasn't any still kicking around that were going to take over. And then he goes and attacks Judah, just to add insult to injury, I suppose. Then Elah, Baasha's son, is murdered after 6 months whilst drunk. It's always good to stay sober when there's people out for your life. And then Zimri, who was a chariot commander, he decided to kill all of Baasha's descendants, Anila, and unfortunately his coup went wrong and people weren't very happy with him. So apparently he was holed up in the city and they attacked the city and he retreated into the citadel and set fire to it with himself in it. So he was only king for about 7 days. So yeah, bad tension going on in the north. So then, down south, you've got Zerah, the Ethiopian, invades Judah. Now, this chap Zerah is probably an Egyptian commander, and he's probably enticed by Israel to come in and attack them. So Asa, the good king, goes down and sees the Egyptians off, and they don't cause any trouble in the land for a while to come. Then Baasha of Israel, just stepping back a bit, goes and captures Ramah. And so therefore Asa has to turn his army around and run north. It's like the Battle of Hastings all over again. Anyway, he gets up there and he also makes an alliance with Ben-Hadad I of Damascus, who comes in on his side and stabs Israel in the back. So you can see just how brotherly this is all going. Anyway, the Arameans attack Israel, who then have to go back and sort out their own problems. Anyway, in Israel, so we've seen Zimri died in a big fire in the citadel. And Omri, who again is one of the big captains, takes charge. And Omri sets up this dynasty that lasts a couple of generations. So, he killed Zimri and brought stability to the northern kingdom of Israel. It was about time they had some stability up there. And he built a new capital in Samaria. And this place was huge. That's the archaeology of what they've dug up so far. And that's what they think that it would have looked like. Pretty impressive for, a second-rate hill country. Anyway, he makes alliances with both Judah and Tyre. It's a good idea to try and get your neighbours on side rather than fighting wars with them. And he does this through marriage. We'll see how those marriages work out in a bit. And he extended Israelite rule into the Transjordan, which is across the river into those places like Moab and Ammon and Edom. And we read about that on the Mesha stele, which was set up by a Moabite king generations later. But he refers to the fact that how Chemosh, their god, had been, angry with them and had caused them to be handed over to the house of Omri. Anyway, Israel is referred to as the house of Omri in the Assyrian annals. So he must have been a big name for the Assyrians to start carving his name on their walls. So anyway, Omri dies and his son Ahab takes over, and that's a picture of one of his signet rings that they found. Now, Ahab was married to Jezebel. This was the marriage alliance with the king of Tyre. Okay, now, she was a Baal worshipper, and as we saw in Solomon's day, it seemed only right that you set up your little chapel with all your things. Now, nobody would have probably batted an eyelid in the Northern Kingdom. They were all into their folk religion and were all kind of a bit backslidden up there anyway. So it probably wasn't such an issue. Only it was a bit of an issue to Elijah and some of the prophets. And, this is the period at which they start kicking off with the prophets of Baal and things like that. Now, you might want to sort of ask yourself some of the questions. What was going on in Jezebel's mind at the time? What was at stake here? And I'm thinking, if we put this into some modern analogies, if you think of Elijah as being somebody a bit like Osama bin Laden, And Jezebel thinking like she's got her modern ways, coming from Tyre with her new ideas and sort of like giving the punters what they like because they like a bit of extra religion around the place. You know, what's this guy Elijah about? Some beardy weirdo who lives out in the desert. And sometimes I think the world, you know, views us a bit like that, thinking we're a bunch of beardy weirdos that live in the desert with our old-fashioned ways. And, you know, I was thinking, you know, and the modernisers out there are like the Jezebels. You know, they're not doing it just simply because they're downright evil. They're doing it because they think they're dragging us kicking and screaming into the 21st century rather than us living in the 10th century. So, you know, those are some of the things, some of the questions you want to ask yourself. Anyway, the Assyrians suddenly decide to come on the scene and think that it's about time that they moved into the Levant and had a piece of the action. So Ahab got wind of this and made a treaty with the Syrians, Hadassah, and they formed a coalition. So Assyria invades northern Syria and starts to, you know, look like he's going to cause trouble. So there's a coalition of 12 kings, including Ahab and Hadassah, and they go off to go and meet the Assyrians. And believe it or not, they actually beat them at the Battle of Karka and send the Assyrians packing, probably for the last time ever. But, you know, it all looks quite good. But once the threat's gone, you know, and the coalition has stopped the Assyrian invasion, the coalition just breaks up. And there's no mention of Israel ever mentioned in the Assyrian records during this. They were probably a bit of a bit player in that. But they managed to stop the Assyrians, but the Assyrians are not going to forget this check that they got up in the north. Anyway, Ahab wanted Ramoth-Gilead back, which was a town of his up in the north on the Syrian borders, and he sat there festering about it. And although he'd been allies with the Syrians, that alliance breaks down. Now, rather than just saying, look, can I have it back, he decides to go to Judah and ask Jehoshaphat, who's the king then at that time, who we'll look at in a bit, to come and help him invade Syria and get Ramoth-Gilead back. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he gets wounded and he dies fighting the Syrians up there. So Ahab's son, Ahaziah, comes into play now. And he's introduced at the end of 1 Kings. And he kind of leaves it. If you read that bit at the end of 1 Kings, a bit of a cliffhanger. He's evil. He walked in the ways of his mother and father, i.e. Ahab and Jezebel. He worshipped and served Baal, and he made Israel to sin. Doesn't sound like any good's going to come of it. Now, in fact, we read, when you get into 2 Kings, that early on in that, he fell through a lattice window and ended up like seriously injured. And this is the story where he sends his guards off down the road to go and ask Elijah if he's going to get better or not. And, you know, the first 50 go up and say, come with me, you've got to go and talk to the king. And then he calls down fire from heaven and burns up the 50. And so then he sends the next 50 down the road. And they go and he says, oi, the king wants you. Fire comes down from heaven and burns him up. And then he sends a third 50. And at that point, the captain who goes falls on his knees and shows the prophet the due respect and said, like, you know, the Lord, you know, be blessed and all that. And then he goes up and doesn't get burned up. So that's that story, and that's where that comes in. Anyway, he didn't last very long, probably less than a year after falling through a lattice window. So then you've got Jehoram, or is otherwise known as Joram in some of the passages in the Bible. Now this is Ahaziah's brother. Okay, now Jezebel was still alive at this time, but he tried to reform Israel's religious situation, not because he was a good king in the mould of Asa, that he wanted things. He just realised that people hated their political party at the moment. You know, they weren't winning the voters at this time, so he thought, if I pull down a few statues and that might win the people over. But all the while that his mother, Jezebel, was still in power and around, things weren't going to change anytime soon. So, Jehoram. He had an ongoing war with Syria, and Mesha leads Moab to rebel, and that was the stele I told you about earlier. And this records how Chemosh managed to help the Moabites get away from the house of Omri. Then the coalition of Israel, Judah, and Edom attempt to pacify Moab. I put that in inverted commas. They wanted to go and sort them out after this indignity. So they all go piling off down to Moab to go and teach the Moabites a lesson. And Mesha's on the back foot, really. They keep winning, they keep beating the Moabites. And Mesha's at a loss as to what to do, so he thinks, I know what I'll do. I'll sacrifice my son and burn him in the fire, and maybe Chemosh will help me. Well, everybody kind of saw what went on and was totally disgusted and just went home. And that's just what the text seems to say. They just thought, that's horrible, and just went home. I don't get that. But anyway, that's what happened there. So, the Moabites just got up to their disgustingness on the other side of the river. Anyway, Jehoram was wounded fighting Syria at Ramoth Gilead. Funnily enough, somebody else was wounded and killed at Ramoth Gilead. So it seems to be the place to run into trouble. Now, he was also murdered by Jehu at Jezreel. Now, he'd returned from Ramoth Gilead, having been a bit wounded, and he went to take the waters at Jezreel, where he bumps into Jehu, who we'll look at in a minute. So let's just go back down south again and look at Judah during this time of the Omrides. So, Jehoshaphat, he married his son to Ahab's daughter. Now, he was a just and able king, and he brought about many judicial forms. He's considered to be a good king. So he made an alliance in marriage with Israel, and we'll see how that one worked out. And he joins Ahab against Syria. So he goes up to help him try and get back his town. And it's possible that at this time Judah was a vassal to the northern kingdom. The northern kingdom seemed to have the power at the time, and maybe Jehoshaphat was just towing the line. Fights against the coalition of Ammon and Moab, which is what we just seen. Anyway, Jehoshaphat dies, Jehoram comes to the throne. Now, he's married to Ahab's daughter, Athaliah, and she's a northern kingdom girl in northern kingdom ways, worshipping Asherahs and being all involved in that sort of thing. And so he walked in the way of the kings of Israel. And in fact, Athaliah is credited to be the reason that he was so bad. I think he was pretty bad himself. Given the fact that he committed fratricide, he killed 7 of his brothers just to make sure none of them were going to get any ideas about replacing him. And then Edom revolted. And he was attacked by Philistines and Arabs. So things started to look like they were going wrong for him. And eventually he died from a disease of the bowels. And it's a particularly nasty way that the chronicler puts it. But it says, and after all the Lord struck him in his bowels with an incurable disease. And in the course of time, at the end of 2 years, his bowels came out because of the disease, and he died in great agony. And his people made no fire in his honour, like the fires of his father. The people that die, usually with things of the bowels, are considered to be particularly evil, which is why we see Herod in Acts. Luke makes a big point about the fact that Herod died of a disease in his bowels. Bad deaths happen to bad people, and this guy was particularly bad if he died because his bowels came out. So then you have Ahaziah, who takes over after that. He joined with Jehoram of Israel against Syria, trying to retake Ramoth Gilead. Now you remember that Jehoram was up there, he got wounded, and he went back to Jezreel. So, as we know, Athaliah was his mother, and he walked in the way of the house of Ahab. And he joined with Jehoram to go and fight Syria. He also was killed by Jehu at Jezreel. Basically, Ahaziah went up to see his mate, Jehoram, and to see how he was getting on, pay him a hospital visit, as it were, when Jehu happens to turn up with his bow and arrow and starts taking everybody down. So this is on your handout sheet, but it's just a helpful way of seeing how the two houses kind of began to start to try and remarry with disastrous consequences. Now, that battle and the death of Jehoram and Ahaziah is also recorded in what we call the Tel Dan Stele. And this is really interesting, and this has only recently come to light. In 1994 it was dug up, and it's become quite controversial, in fact. It seems to be a stele that was erected by a Syrian king, and it contains this Aramaic inscription commemorating the victories over local ancient peoples, including Israel and the house of David. Now, the important bit in this is, and thousands of horsemen I killed Jehoram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Azahahu, son of Jehoram, king of the house of David. And so here we have both the kings from the north and the south dying at the same time in the same place by the same hand. And so that is one of those kind of bits of archaeology that you dig up once in a lifetime and suddenly say, I've actually found something that corroborates here what is in the Bible. Not that we need the archaeological corroboration, but I think, this is really interesting. What's even more interesting is the amount of controversy surrounding it, with the number of scholars who don't want to believe in the Lord or do anything about that, trying to dismiss this and, reinterpret what's going on in this text and everything like that. But I thought it's very interesting. So it would suggest that Jehu, if this is right, that Jehu was probably in the pay of the Syrians when he was dispatching these two kings. So the kings are dead. The king in the north and the king in the south. They're both dead. So what now? Let's have a coffee and a toilet break.